the highest King would welcome me. I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free. Oh, it's free. Ransomed me, his grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God, yes I am.
It is my estimation, as we sit here today, that we have all had bad days. We've all probably endured seasons that seem like a big struggle. We've had to try to figure out our way through what we've called persnickety situations. There's that word again. And most likely, at one point or another, we've been maligned and mistreated, maybe even marginalized at some point. Most of the time, by the grace of God, we actually make it through these times somewhat unscathed. But there are times when the storms that we seem to be stuck in become shipwrecks, and life can feel like it's been snake bitten. It's my estimation that as we come together Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, as we practice the same liturgy week after week after week, that is taking time to fellowship, making a space to pray, establishing monumental moments that we could recognize the presence of God even as we worship. As we open up His Word and do our best to go beyond the facts and figures and allow it to reveal to us a God who is madly in love with us. And as a result, present with us, no matter what our circumstances may be, have been, or will be. As we remember His love in communion, as we give unto Him like He has given unto us, as we practice this liturgy that I believe is sacred, not sacred that we have to change how we are to come near it, but sacred in that Jesus has provided it for us and we are invited to come as we are. And as we come, it's my estimation that maybe there are people in this room, even as there are definitely people in this neighborhood, and without a doubt, people within our spheres of influence that are trying to figure out how to make their way through this storm. Stressed out and anxious over the possibility that it might become a shipwreck. Terrified that once again, life has been snake-bitten. I know for a fact, as a result of talking to some of you, that that's exactly where you find yourself today. And I want you to know that as we make it through God's Word and go beyond the platitudes of it'll be okay and trust God and have faith, but as we go beyond that and we engage the truth, it is my estimation that we will find encouragement to continue holding on to Him no matter what it is that we're going through. So if that's you, I would encourage you, hold on. Grab the bottoms of your seat, dig your fingernails in, and don't let go. I also recognize that the room may be filled with some people that are going through life in such a way that everything is fantastic. And that also should be celebrated. I would ask you to not let the reality of making your way through difficult days to get to the day that you're at now where everything is sunshine, roses, lollipops, and gumdrops. Don't ever forget that that's a gift from God and it's His faithfulness that has brought us to that place, and celebrate it with a peaceful heart and a smile on your face and a warm, kind greeting to the community around you. Either way, whether we're going through it now, we'll go through it later, or know people that are going through difficult days today, I believe as we make our way, are you ready for it? Through Acts chapter 26, 27, and part of 28. I have two responses. Some of you, my response would be, ye of little faith. To others, the response would be, thank you for believing that we can do the impossible. You see, as we make our way through Acts chapter 26, 27, and 28, we are, through God's word, witnessing the Apostle Paul make his way through all of the things that we've been talking about. He himself endured bad days. This is a long season of struggle filled with persnickety circumstances. He has definitely over and over and over been marginalized, maligned, even marginalized and set aside, mistreated. All of those things are true, and we find him as we make our way through this passage in the midst of a what the word calls a violent storm, only to be shipwrecked and ultimately snake bitten. And I think as we make our way through and consider how the Apostle Paul made it through, we will find not only anchors for our souls, but we'll also find encouragement to keep holding on, no matter what. As we read earlier, Acts chapter 26, verses 1 through 11 speak of Paul giving a defense before King Agrippa. Remember, he's in Caesarea by the sea. It's a beautiful landscape. It's a beautiful place. And he is invited before his accusers to begin to make his defense. And basically what Paul says there that's worth noting is he makes it clear that his accusers should have known that he was once just like them. And in doing so, it's not that Paul is saying, I was once like you and I'm better than you. But what he is saying is, I was once like you, I thought like you, I lived like you, I practiced the same religious observances as you, yet something happened. And when Paul moves in Acts chapter 26, verse 11 to verse 12, he begins to tell them what happened. And in Acts chapter 26, verses 12 through 32, he gives his testimony. He lets them know that as I was on the road to Damascus, Jesus himself interrupted my existence and changed everything, including my destiny, my divine purpose. He changed everything. I would no longer seek out practicers of the way so that I could mistreat them, arrest them, beat them, and get rid of them. Instead, Jesus has called me, Paul will say, to go throughout the entire world, encouraging those who practice the way of Jesus and sharing the gospel with the Gentile world, that world that was largely ignored by his Jewish brethren. You see, Paul, at the end of Acts chapter 26, begins to tell them, I was just like you, but God intervened. The same God, remember, the same God that we worship has changed the way I walk. That's important for us. It's important to recognize that Paul was meeting them right where they're at, letting them know, I was just like you, but God intervened and changed some things. Turn to the book of Acts chapter 27. As we look at Acts chapter 27, the first 12 verses describe that at that point, Paul was put on a ship where he would begin to sail towards Rome. And as he was sailing, it's worth noting that the scriptures tell us that it was a dangerous voyage due to the season in which they were sailing, a point that Paul himself made very clear. You see in Acts chapter 27, verses 1 through 12, Paul says in verse 10, Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. Paul made it clear, like, this is going to be difficult. Notice that Paul makes it clear, I recognize this is going to be difficult. Maybe we should be doing something different. He did not whine and moan and say, oh my gosh, it's going to be tough. I can't do this. He just recognized, look, this is going to be hard. We all know how these journeys go during this time of year, and it's going to be difficult. Maybe we should rethink what it is that our plans are. However, the decision was made by those in charge to continue on with the journey. And in Acts chapter 27, verses 13 through 38, we're told about the storm that they endured at sea. Just as Paul had predicted, the voyage became deadly, at which point Paul proclaimed that God would protect everyone who stayed aboard the ship. Look at Acts chapter 27, verse 21. We pick it up with Luke's description. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, notice, since they had been without food for a long time, in this Acts chapter 26, 27, and 28, we'll come to realize there's over 200 people on board this ship. And they've all been without food for a very long time. When Luke uses these descriptors, it's not just Luke being detailed. It's Luke being detailed so that we understand what it is that was going on. Paul was on a ship full of desperate people that were in the midst of some terrible circumstances, a storm that they feared would shipwreck them and take their life. And not only that, they were hungry at the same time. Have you ever suffered hunger pangs? I recognize it's a weird question because as Americans, we only suffer those for maybe hours, let alone hardly ever days. How many of you allow yourself to feel those pains for days on end? Just a few people. We should talk afterwards. Most of us, though, we don't allow those pains to last long, right? When the pangs of hunger hit our lives, our stomach, which then sends messages to our brain that cause our eyes to start perceiving that there's a McDonald's around the corner, we do something about it. But when you're in a ship with 200 other people and there's a storm that's so bad that every sailor thinks that they're going to die, you have to recognize what Luke wants us to know is they were desperate. There were sailors from all over the world. There were Roman soldiers from all over the world. And there was Paul and his companions. People from all over, desperate, not knowing what to do. And based on where they had come from, probably had their own game plans. The sailors had expertise about what to do during these days. Let's get rid of stuff. Let's make the ship light. Maybe by some sort of circumstance, if the winds change directions, we might make it through. Roman soldiers deciding, listen, we can't lose these captives, so let's get rid of them now. Because if we go down, let's make sure we go down doing our job. To which Paul stands up and he says these words, men, I love this, men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail for Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Listen, it's important for us to understand that what is happening theologically is that Paul is communicating, you have brought this on yourself. God did not do this. Which is a popular thing to say in our culture, isn't it? It's easy to blame circumstances on God. And it's easy to do that because I don't know about you, but I don't like taking responsibility for my own bad decisions. And if Paul left it there, it would be kind of brutal. You brought this on yourselves, good luck. But he doesn't. He says, look, you should have listened to me. You were warned, and yet you insisted on doing this. You have brought this desperate situation on yourself. And then he gives them words of hope. Yet now I urge you to take heart, verse 22 of Acts chapter 27, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night, verse 23, there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. Paul went on to say, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run the ship aground on some island. So when the 14th night had come, and as we were driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land, so they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. There's no agnostics in the bottom, in the depths of a storm-tossed ship. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under the pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. I love that Luke gives us these details that enable us to imagine just how desperate and dramatic this scene really was, and how faithful Paul remains in the middle of it all. He continues on. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all some 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Paul makes it clear in the midst of this storm that everything was going to be okay because God had promised him that it would be okay. And not just for him, but anyone who stays on board. I believe this, that Luke gives us these details in such a way that we are supposed to be encouraged by how gracious God was with all people, not just Paul. I believe Luke gives us these details so that we could see that just as Paul's faith had far-reaching circumstances for the people around him, so does ours. I believe that Luke gives us these details so that we might be encouraged to understand that no matter what circumstances we find ourselves in, God has promised not to forsake us or leave us stranded. And in fact, he understands how it is that we feel in the middle of these circumstances. And not only does he understand, but he can bring comfort and hope. And as we embrace, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3, that the God of all comfort will meet us even in the midst of the most miserable circumstances and comfort our souls, we're supposed to understand that that's supposed to have far-reaching effects for the people around us, because we are called by God to comfort those around us who are going through difficult days with the very same comfort that he has comforted us with. Yes, it's a storm at sea, but not one that was beyond God's ability to work good things out of. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, the first time I read this, I can remember I was about 19 to 20 years old, and I can remember, 19 to 20 years old, growing up in the 80s, watching lots of movies. And don't you know, the movies in the 80s were probably the best that were ever made. And they all had happy endings on one level. And so for me, I was predisposed to believe that this shipwreck, like this storm, wouldn't end in a shipwreck, but God would somehow miraculously make the storm go away, because Jesus can. So it's going to go away, right? I had just read the Gospels. I had known in one sense in my little tiny Christian baby mind. I don't know why I said it like that. But I believe that all Jesus had to do, even from heaven, the right hand of God the Father, all he had to do was do this, and the storm would go away. Because he can transcend time and space and circumstances, and he can do that. So I'm reading along, and I'm thinking, okay, it's all going to be okay. And then you keep reading, and you recognize in Acts chapter 27, verses 39 through 44, it doesn't go away, and they experience a shipwreck. A shipwreck. I don't spend a lot of time on ships because I'm afraid of wrecks. Is everybody okay with that? On occasion, we go north of Seattle to visit Bethany's parents. And the only way to get, one of the only way, you have two choices. You can drive way north and around and go on land in a bridge and get to her her parents' house on Whidbey Island. Or the quicker way, most of the time, is you park your car on a ship that ferries you across this deep body of water that always seems to be really tumultuous. Bethany grew up making this voyage, if you will, on a regular basis. I did not. From Southern Oregon. There's no water around here except for a river that we can stay away from and lakes that we play in. So the first time on this ferry, I sat there looking out the window, literally hands gripping the seat so tight with all of the anxiety and worry. At one point, Ezekiel, on another journey, he was standing up in the window, watching everything, being blown away, taking really cool pictures of this baby boy looking out at the sea. And I'm thinking, the window could break and we're all in trouble. Get him down. But I have to be cool, right? So I say, Ezekiel, why don't you let Daddy hold you? I'm not a great dad because I push upon my own children, my own issues. Forgive me. It's a shipwreck that takes place. Acts 27, verse 39 says this. Now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. In other words, they're giving up on the ship. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But, verse 41, striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the storm and the surf. The soldiers, verse 42, their plan was to kill the prisoners lest anyone swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all 276 persons were brought safely to the land. And in the midst of that drama, the most appropriate response from God's people throughout time and history should be, praise the Lord. Now, some of us might be thinking, but wait a minute, there were other prisoners. Didn't they deserve to die? They probably did something really bad, and they should have to take responsibility for their actions. Others might be thinking, yeah, but those Roman soldiers, they were evil people who just wanted Jesus to be dead. Others might be thinking, yeah, but some of them didn't necessarily deserve the grace of God. To which I would respond, you were probably once a prisoner who deserved worse than what God gave you. You were probably once a soldier who worked against the purposes and plans of God. We were all at one time sinners opposed to the mighty, gracious, loving, and kind work of God in the world. And God gives them grace. What they don't know is as they graciously make their way to the shore safe, what they don't know is that God is granting them, according to his grace, more time to come to know him before they perish. It is not his desire that anyone should perish, but that everyone would come to know Jesus, or at least that they would have the choice. So even in the midst of a shipwreck, these circumstances, these storms that become shipwrecks, we still see the gracious hand of God. And if you are in the midst of one of those times right now, I would only implore you to be cognizant of the very breath that you are breathing right now, the very tears that you are shedding right now, the very hurt that is in your heart are all evidences that you are still alive, to which God still has an opportunity to bring his gracious, loving kindness and power to the very circumstances you're struggling to find a way through. He is still on the throne. And no storms, shipwrecks, or even snake bites can overcome him. So look at what happens, Acts chapter 28. Did you guys notice we're on Acts chapter 28? Acts chapter 28, verse 1, after we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. And the native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all because it had begun to rain and it was cold. Get the scene in your mind. The natives there, the people that were on that island, they showed them unusual kindness because without a doubt, they had just watched them go through circumstances that were overwhelming and they felt some sort of compassion for them. My goodness. You got to know that there were probably some on the seashore watching them going, that person's going to make it. I don't think that one's looking too good. So they built him a fire because it was cold. And it was wet, and it was rainy. Verse 3, when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. I like biblical language sometimes. I would say this, Paul was putting some sticks on the fire, and a snake come out and bit him on the hand. Just so you know, I am personally terrified of snakes. Terrified. Like terrified. Like I can't see them in a book or on TV without the skin on my body crawling and the hair sticking up. And I have a fight or flight, usually flight mentality when it comes to snakes. My wife and I, don't judge us, but we're watching old seasons of Survivor. And we're currently on Survivor Amazon, season 7 or 6. And it's filled with snakes. And I kid you not, sometimes, again, don't judge me, we're watching these episodes in the comfort of our own bed. Don't judge me. And I'll see a snake on the screen. This happened last night. I see a snake on the screen because that's the way they produce it and put it together to create intrigue and drama. And I kid you not, I have an overwhelming urge to get out of bed and make sure that there's no slithering, deadly serpent under my covers. This is how afraid of snakes I am. Paul, putting wood on a fire, was bitten by a snake who came to life, if you will, because of the warmth that the fire was producing. Which I don't think is a coincidence. This life is filled with comfort and trouble, and the tension is always closer than we think. So the snake bites him, fastens onto his hand. Verse 4, when the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, no doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. They knew that it was a deadly viper. And they knew, according to their experience, anybody bitten by this deadly viper was sure to die at any moment. Verse 5, he, however, Paul, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. Paul was a bad man. He'd been promised by God that he was going to make it to Rome and testify before Caesar to the gospel, to God's love. And it's interesting to me that no serpent, did you hear that? It's interesting to me that no serpent before, during, or even at this moment or hereafter will ever be able to stop the spread of the gospel. No serpent will ever stop the spread of the gospel. The serpent will be defeated, was defeated once and for all by Jesus on the cross. This serpent does Paul no harm. So, here's what happens. This blows their mind. Verse 6, they were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. But when they had waited a long time, can you imagine? They're just watching. People are weird. People in the Bible were weird. People in this room are weird. People out there are weird. We're just weird creatures. By the grace of God, go we. Amen? So while they were waiting for him to swell up and suddenly fall down dead, but when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god, which according to their history and their past was the only reasonable thing to conclude. And you got to know that Paul would, just like he had before to people who had claimed that he was a God, think Acts chapter 14. Without a doubt, Paul would correct that. And look at what happens. Now, in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery. And Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. And when he had taken his place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They also honored us greatly, and when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever we needed. Paul has gone through the worst circumstances that we could imagine. Just read through the last 5 chapters in the book of Acts. He's been marginalized and maligned. He's been mistreated. Even at this point, he's a prisoner upon a ship that experiences such a violent storm that it causes the ship to wreck. And if that's not the end of it, he gets safely delivered to a nearby island only to be bitten by a deadly viper that does not kill him. If I'm Paul, I'm like, you know what? I've made it this far. I'm going to chill out. I'm going to go on sabbatical for a while. I'm going to take a little me time and not do any kind of ministry and just breathe it in until I actually get to Rome, because this is all a bit overwhelming. But that's not what Paul does. The people see, like, whoa, he must be a god. Paul's like, I'm really not, but I serve the one true God. And they're like, well, how one and true is he? So Paul says, well, I've heard that your father is sick. Let's see what we can do. And he goes and he prays for him and he gets better. To which the whole island says, well, we have more sick people. And Paul says, bring them here. He does not rest. He continues to care. I'm so impressed by this. I'm so impressed. Have you ever had a long season of caring for people and all you want is for it to be over, even though the gospel says it should probably never be over and you're supposed to care selflessly just like Jesus, but you recognize I'm not Jesus and surely Jesus is okay if I take a day off? This is what's going on. I think we're going to pick up the rest. We're going to actually finish the book of Acts next week. But I think it's worth noting that Luke wants his readers to understand that Paul was not only a heavenly directed man with a God-given message, but also a heavenly protected man with a God-given destiny of proclaiming the gospel in Rome. It's also worth noting that not even this deadly serpent could stop God's plan. It's also worth noting that there are 3 things about Paul and his life that seem to be shipwrecked and snake-bitten that we should pay attention to. Number 1, as a result of God's intervention in his life, Paul was uncompromising about his commitment to talk about Jesus. Acts chapter 26, he gives his testimony. No matter how bad his circumstances are, he was uncompromising, even though his flesh probably cried out, even though his spirit was probably weak, even though his feelings were overwhelmed, even though he had been mistreated, maligned, marginalized, even though there were a million excuses so as to keep his mouth shut, he was uncompromising in his commitment to tell the world about God's love in Christ. That, by the way, was a result of God's intervention in his life. Number 2, as a result of God's devotion to his life, Paul was unflinching about his faith in the promises of God. In Acts chapter 27, when they're on board the ship and everybody believes that all hope is lost, Paul stands up and says, don't lose hope. I had a dream, and in that dream, I was told that it's all going to be okay. And I trust in the promises of God. And as a result of that, so did others, and everything ended up being okay. As a result of God's devotion to his life, Paul was unflinching about his faith in the promises of God. Number 3, as a result of God's transformation of his life, Paul was unselfish about his care and concern for those who were loved by the Lord. For God so loved the world, including these native people on the island of Malta. And so Paul, in the midst of some of the worst circumstances imaginable to us, continues to give himself to the communicating of the gospel, to trusting in the promises of God, and taking care of the people around him. I believe it's awe-inspiring. I believe these 3 things should be an encouragement to anyone and everyone who is going through difficult days. But I think you should also recognize they're not just 3 things that you're to walk out and try to make happen. How many of us have done that before? Well, pastor preached a really good sermon. Thank you. Giving me 3 things that I can definitely hold on to. 3 practices that I can engage that'll help me in the way of Jesus. All I got to do is walk out the door, and in the midst of a difficult situation, all I got to do is try harder to be a better Christian. Some of us will walk out with that mentality, but let me make it very clear, that is not what I'm asking you to do. Nor do I believe that that is what God would have us do. I think the language that I wrote down was very, very specific. That as a result of God's intervention, as a result of God's devotion, and as a result of God's transformation, Paul became the person that we read about. What I would implore each of us to do as we walk out the doors today is to re-engage our relationship with God on a real and honest level. Could it be that we're supposed to see that Paul was able to make it through some of the most mind-numbingly difficult days as a result of his relationship with God? It is a relationship, it is a relational dynamic that I think C.S. Lewis spoke of that can be helpful. He said this: God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, and shouts to us in our pains. What we're supposed to understand, according to the author Lewis, is this: our relationship with God is dynamic and profound and always at play. When times are going good, when times are not so good, and when times are terrible, God is still relationally available to all of us to speak, to whisper, and to yell, scream, implore if necessary. My hope and prayer is that we hear his voice and we engage our relationship with him. The key to making it through whatever comes our way, the good times or the bad, or anything in between, is an always maturing relationship with God, which will enable us to grow through any circumstance in a way that glorifies God and blesses the people around us.